Hello all, and welcome to the very last webinar in this series this summer on practical solutions to regional food security, hosted by the University of Arizona College of Engineering and co-sponsored by the World Academy of Sciences and the Inter-Academy Partnership. I'm Terry Murray, Professor of Physics and the Deputy Director for Research at Biosphere 2 here at the UA, and one of the 6 co-chairs of the Inter-Academy Partnership. I'm pleased to be the event chair for 2 UA Science, Health, and Engineering Policy and Diplomacy webinars this week. The first one took place last Tuesday on global food security challenges. This one today is going to present some practical regional solutions. The UN Secretary General has called for a UN Food Systems Summit in September of this year. In Tuesday's webinar, we heard about the goals of the summit and some of the activities leading up to it. And we heard summaries of a major series of Inter-Academy Partnership reports on regional and global challenges to our food systems. The call for the UN Food Systems Summit reflects a growing recognition that our 20th century food systems are damaging the environment and inequitable. Food systems are the systems that produce, aggregate, process, distribute, consume, and dispose of food products that originate from agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and food industries. On Tuesday, we heard that these food systems are a major cause of degradation of soil, water, and air quality, biodiversity loss, and climate change. They are inequitable. There is growing obesity and waste, as well as growing hunger and malnutrition. Current food systems are not providing affordable, adequate nutrition and healthy diets to 3 billion people right now. Farm productivity in the developing world, and especially in Africa, is considerably below that of the developed countries and necessitates 40% imports of their food. The global population is projected to increase by 2 or 3 billion people in only a few decades, and most of that will be in Africa. On top of this, food systems are challenged in that climate change and farming practices are causing increasing desertification around the world. Today, we will hear from an expert panel of scientists and engineers who are actively working to provide practical on-the-ground solutions for a transformation of food systems. Their focus is mostly on agriculture, so kind of the first part of the system. Given that the University of Arizona is in the Sonoran Desert, we have a great interest here in arid land, agriculture, and water. One of our original panelists, Sigenet Kelamu, had an emergency and will not be able to speak today from Nairobi. But luckily, we were able to have Kim Ogden from UA join the panel. So we have 3 panelists from Arizona, Jeff Silvertooth, Joel Coelho, and Kim Ogden, and 1, Modi Harari, from an even more harsh desert, the Arava Desert in Israel, where there is considerable collaboration with African farmers. I look forward to the panel. But before we get started, I'd like to hand the microphone to David Hahn, Dean of the College of Engineering, for his welcome.
Thank you, Cherry, for your opening comments and your insight and to help really frame today's discussion. We're grateful for that. I'm David Hahn, the Craig M. Birch Dean of the College of Engineering, and it is my pleasure to welcome our audience members to the second of 2 panel discussions this week in our Global Food Security Challenges and Solutions webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I am excited to help open today's session on regional food security. As I shared earlier in the week, and I do apologize for any redundancy in my comments, my brief comments this morning, the College of Engineering is embarking on a multi-year expansion with the goal of doubling our current student enrollment. And that growth is driven by the need to increase the nation's STEM workforce, fueling Arizona's and the nation's economy as problem solvers. That's what engineers do. And when I talk to high school students about science and engineering to get them excited and motivated, I always talk about the big societal problems, the grand challenges, and the top of my list is always ensuring a safe, plentiful, affordable food and water supply to a growing world's population. And particularly in times of extreme climate events, such as the severe drought we're experiencing in the Southwest, global tariffs on food items, and as Cherry mentioned, just general inequity with the availability of food and water around the globe. And I'm really glad to see the University of Arizona scientists and engineers leading not only research, but leading in discussions like this to help frame the problems and bring people together collaboratively. So it's a really pleasure to have these types of events. So it's now my pleasure to introduce your moderator for this morning's session, Professor Joaquin Ruiz from the University of Arizona. He is Vice President of Global Environmental Futures and Professor of Geochemistry and holder of the Thomas R. Brown Chair in Biomedical Engineering. Joaquin has held many roles during his career since joining the University of Arizona, including a 20-year tenure as the Dean of the College of Science. Joaquin is known internationally for his work, ranging from the origins of life to present-day climate change. He's a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences, among many other professional accolades. Joaquin, it's a pleasure to turn things over to you this morning.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you, David and Sherry, for allowing me to run the show today. I am extremely excited about the presentations that we'll be all hearing, because I'm a great fan of every single member of the panel today. I've known many of them for many years, and I highly respect what they do. I also want to thank Brian Topping and Jennifer Krause for the behind the scenes operations. I wouldn't even be able to get on the screen if it wasn't for them. So thank you all for your being part of this thing. So Tuesday, there was a webinar that described the view of experts of the challenges of global food security. And today, the exciting thing, as Sherry pointed out, is that we'll be hearing from people that are actually getting their hands dirty, no pun intended, in getting food growing in areas that would be considered inhospitable by many. The presentations will be by the first person that will be talking today is Jeff Silvertooth, who is an extension specialist. He's been growing food in the state of Arizona for many, many years and helping understand the plant soil dynamics in these systems. And he is well recognized. He's a fellow of the Agronomy Society. So he is a world expert. And I can say that whenever I have a problem with friends in countries that have to do with agronomy, I go to Jeff immediately because of the respect I have for him. So Jeff, I think we can start with you now, and I will then present the rest of the speakers as they come along. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Joaquin. Appreciate that. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. And I'd like to offer a special thanks for my opportunity to participate. And this morning, to start out the discussion, I'm going to offer a few comments regarding food, fiber, energy, and water, the interactions, the nexus of food, energy, and water in relation to our global food security challenges and solutions. Anytime we begin to think about the relationships of food, energy, and water, it's probably best that we start at the most fundamental point, that is with the basic reaction of photosynthesis, as described briefly in a very simplified form on this slide, where we see that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is combined with water, with the consumption of energy that's driven from the sun through the chlorophyll in the plant, forming the most basic form of food, of simple carbohydrate. And it's interesting to note that this process begins naturally in this combination of water with energy to form food, but it also carries through in all of our, say, man-made type of systems that we operate and we manage and engineer along the way in our processing of food. So irrespective of the type of food that we have, and the form of that food or whence it comes from, plant or animal products or fiber products. What we're dealing with is a large consumption of energy along the process of development, production, transportation, and processing. And of course, fundamental to all of this is water. So we're looking at a three-dimensional system. When we talk about food production, we really have to always be thinking about energy and water. They all three are intimately connected and interdependent with one another. We quite often, though, think about these terms in a single-dimensional format, maybe a two-dimensional format. But what we really have to think of is the interactions of all three together. We also have to be realistic in understanding whatever we conceive, whatever we want to dream up to address our problems, we have to do that within the real world constraints of economics. There's a price to be paid. There's an economic series of constraints to deal with. Realistically, we're also dealing with, in the real world, the political realm. So we have our food, energy, and water interactions with economic constraints within a political realm. And we have to be realistic about what we can do and how we can get it done. And then, of course, there's the additional set of constraints, the environmental constraints. We have definite limitations, finite resources to work with, and they vary from place to place and situation, case to case. So we have to be realistic about our projections in the development of concepts that we want to take to the field with regard to being more efficient with food, energy, and water. Globally speaking, I think it's good to set an open perspective in terms of what we're working with from the very beginning. Globally, as Sherry mentioned, we're dealing with an unprecedented population level on the planet of about 7.7 billion people today, rapidly growing at a 1% growth rate, with projections to take us to about 10 billion people by the mid part of the century. This represents a huge increase in population that will place huge demands for food, shelter, and clothing, as Sherry indicated from the beginning. And that also concomitantly produces a huge demand on food, energy, and water. So we're right on track with this 1% growth rate since the middle part of the 20th century. And there's no evidence right now that we're going to deviate from that projection to hit about 10 billion people in the next 30 years. With regard to land resources, a finite resource we're working with, we're really out utilizing all of the land that would be considered as arable or potentially arable today. And so we really have no new land. Our concern is to try to preserve lands that are suffering from degradation and loss, such as urbanization, huge increases of urbanization loss across the planet every day of prime soil resources, soil salinization, particularly in arid and semi-arid regions, soil erosion and deforestation impacts are important. Whenever we look at the production of any kind of plants and animals in a terrestrial ecosystem, there are commonly considered three most limiting factors. The first most limiting factor globally is usually sunlight, followed by water and bioavailable nitrogen. In arid and semi-arid regions, such as where I've been working for more than 3 decades in Arizona, the desert Southwest, sunlight is certainly not a limiting factor. Matter of fact, we have more of that than we probably need. But water definitely becomes our first most limiting factor, followed by bioavailable nitrogen. And then very importantly, what kind of a genetic construct and genetic base do we have to work with to utilize that system? So certainly we're dealing with a system where we have water as the first most limiting factor, but in most of our parts of the world, such as the desert Southwest is a good example, arid and semi-arid regions have geologically young, rather very fertile soils. They can be rendered very productive if we have adequate water for reclamation of salinity and sodicity. And then we can push those systems towards productivity with tremendous success with regard to some of the highest yields per unit area in the world, some of the highest quality of crops in the world, and also some of the most important areas with regard to seed production that can be transported around the world utilizing this environment. The problems that we face today are unique to us today, but they are not new to those of us trying to work and survive on this planet. I offer one example, the Dr. Norman Borlaug and his colleagues that began a program with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. We call it CIMMYT, with the Spanish name of Centro Internacional de Mejoramiento de Maíz y Trigo. We call it CIMMYT, the Center for International Wheat and Corn Improvement, that's based in Mexico. They began this program in 1944 with the same kind of recognitions and concerns as we're describing today, very similar. And they focused their program on genetics, plant breeding, with an orientation to improving resistance and from certain plant pathogens as they move forward to help nations, particularly who were suffering from the inability to supply sufficient food to support their own populations. They focused primarily on wheat production as one of the major staple crops. They centered their programs in Mexico and in the highlands of central Mexico, and also in the Sonoran Desert, just about 400 miles south of where we reside today in Tucson, Arizona. They're working in Obregon, in the area of the Yaqui Valley of Sonora. They developed a shuttle breeding system where they could actually implement two cycles, two plant cycles in a given year, in an annual cycle. And they accelerated their breeding program such that they, within several years, just about 10 years, could develop semi-dwarf varieties that had improved disease resistance, particularly rust disease, that they could begin implementing into production systems in Mexico and South Asia. Mexico, as a result of this, became a net exporter of wheat by 1963. That was just 20 years since the beginning of this program, which in this kind of context was relatively fast. In 1965 to 70, wheat yields nearly doubled in Pakistan and India. This process was referred to as the Green Revolution, and it's estimated it saved at least 1 billion people from starvation. Now, Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, the only agronomist to ever do that, by the way, one of our agronomic heroes, but he also recognized clearly his work was just a beginning, where he recognized we would be right where we are today if we didn't keep up with this and stay after it. What they also realized through this process was these improved germplasm materials that were taken to the field. The limiting factor was water. And if sufficient irrigation water was provided, the genetic potential could be better realized by these materials. As a result, we've seen across the world a rapid increase in the past 70 years of irrigated lands worldwide. This figure shows lands irrigated from 1950 to 2000. And just in that decade, we went from 100,000 hectares, 100 million hectares, to close to 300 million hectares of irrigated land worldwide, largely driven by improved germplasm and the capacity to realize those potentials. So what you see today is a very high proportion of our fresh water on this planet being directed towards agriculture. And this particular figure shows the gold sections of several continents around the planet and the overall utilization of water. You notice that increases quite rapidly in the arid and semi-arid regions of the world, where we support about 50%, 40% of the human population. And we have about 60% of the total grain production, about 40% of the total crop production taking place in these arid and semi-arid regions. And we recognize too that this still is supporting almost close to half of the global population today. We're also dealing with urbanization, so fewer and fewer people are actually directly involved in agriculture. There's a huge disconnect that we have with regard to urban people and people working in the rural areas that are actually in the process of producing food. This is very real for us, and it's a problem that we need to recognize, or a factor we need to recognize. Where 60% of the population today globally is living in and working in an urban type setting, with a rapid increase at about 2% per year. 83% of the US population is urban-based, with about a 1% change annually. In Arizona, there's a great example at about 90% urban-based, with a 2% growth rate similar to the global pace. So we see this rapid change, and this changes the complexion of how we actually are able to implement these kinds of changes with regard to food security. I think Edward Wilson from Harvard puts it pretty nicely when he suggests that we're going through the bottleneck as a human population, driven by, first, maximum human population levels, putting a maximum demand on natural resources, which in turn places a maximum demand on human ingenuity to overcome these challenges. Similar to Wilson, I'm optimistic that we can do this, but I'm not going to suggest this morning that it's easy. One place to begin, a very important place to begin in this process, I firmly believe, is with improvement of our efficiencies of our crop production systems. And with efficiencies, I would define that in three ways: agronomic efficiency, economic efficiency, and of course, environmental efficiency. Quite often we address each of these individually, but I do strongly contend that we can address all three successfully, simultaneously, but it takes real management to do so. And I think it's important in the process of our discussions like this to recognize that science is a key component to solving and addressing these efficiency issues at all three levels, but it also is crop production, food production is an art and a science, like a lot of our professions. And we have to have people with the capacity to pull these together and integrate these systems successfully to make them work most efficiently. A good example for a practical solution that we've worked with, and I contend that we could do this in a lot of places, is to first understand, particularly in irrigated conditions in these arid and semi-arid regions, the phenological growth patterns with regard to the crops we have as a function not only of days of planting, but of actual climate conditions. We use heat units accumulated after planting to use as a chronological pace for phenological development. We've been able to then set out these phenological growth patterns for crops in a very predictable way. This is an example with cotton, but it's very predictable if we have adequate heat unit information and under irrigated conditions. Then we can look at our information, the data that we've brought from our research programs to say, what's the time and phenologically when we have peak nitrogen demand, for example, peak water demand? How do we overlay those demand periods in relation to phenological growth to understand when do we need to provide nutrients or inputs into the system, water and nutrients? When is it most critical? When can we reach a point of better efficiency with regard to the points of these inputs? And we've done this with crops like cotton. We've worked with melons and cantaloupes to do the same thing very successfully. Also with chilies. We could do this with a plethora of crops, given the information that we have with heat unit information, good meteorological data, and of course, uptake and physiological requirement informations, but putting it to work in the field in a practical way with tools like this are extremely important. And this is true for all of our irrigation systems. Irrigation systems is one of the major places that we need to improve our efficiencies with regard to the utilization of our water. And that's true with regard to any of our irrigation system types, irrespective of surface, flood, sprinklers, drip irrigation, etc. We're all starkly reminded that the pressures are real. There's monuments that exist in Arizona. This is the Casa Grande National Monument, about 60 miles from where I'm speaking today. That's a monument to a civilization that lived in a concentrated population in this same desert about 800 years ago. Evidence would suggest that they encountered a serious drought, increasing salinization in their soils, and incapacity to produce crops, food, to support a concentrated population. And they dispersed into the desert, into some of the Native American reservations we work with and see today. They didn't leave behind a written record, but there's other forms of evidence to support their problems were very similar to ours today. So the problems and the challenges that we face are real. And we have the monuments of many civilizations around the world that lay testimony to that. And as we address our challenges with regard to food security, food production, I think it's important for us to look at the interactions, the nexus of food, energy, and water, and do so realistically in the real world with economic constraint considerations, realizing we have to deal with the political realm, and we're dealing with environmental constraints of our finite resources as well. I firmly believe, of course, I have a bias. I've spent more than 3 decades working in extension, research, and education, where we do the work in the field, work with practical problems, we take it to the field, we work with the people at the production level, and we actually deal with them and learn from them as to how we better can modify these systems. Where are the points of adjustment and the points of change that can take place? And we have to do all of this work scientifically with full rigor and validity, but we have to be practical and real. And there's no way this is going to happen if we don't get out and get in the field and work with the people on the ground. They're good at what they do, and we need to work with them and learn from them in the process. I appreciate the chance to be with you all today as we consider the utilization and the improvement of our capacities to manage these resources and our crop production systems around the world for the benefit of the people that we have here today and the people that are coming behind us. We have not only to think about our children and grandchildren, but we have a responsibility to the unborn generations yet to come. We stand on the shoulders of many that have preceded us, and we have a responsibility to be good stewards of these resources that we live on this planet, and to move them forward productively and safely for the generations ahead. Thank you very much for the time to participate today. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion this morning. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jeff. That was truly extraordinary, and you've certainly put the whole day in perspective. There are a bunch of questions that have come in, and there's going to be a question and answer session at the end of the whole presentation. So I'm going to leave them most for the back. I'm just going to ask you one, which is very simple, and which may not come at the very end. So we have a question about whether soil rotation is a good thing or not.
Absolutely. That's a fundamental practice, Joaquin. It's a very good question. I appreciate that. I would say that that's one of the things that we oftentimes are not utilizing today. We go into too many systems around the world, go into a monoculture kind of approach where we're not using rotations, but rotations are fundamental. There's a renaissance with regard to the utilization and development of crop rotations. But if you go back agronomically, you'll find that that's been a fundamental piece of sustainable crop production systems around the world for centuries. But we need to get back to that. And you know what's has driven us away from good practices like that quite often are the economic constraints, the economic incentives for people to maintain a single cropping system or single crop intercropping system and not to rotate appropriately. But very short answer to the question, yes, crop rotations are important. I'm a strong advocate of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And you and I should go and have a beer and discuss those little circles that you have on your triangle. I would put them in a different order. So we should talk about
we could, yeah, absolutely. They change day to day, don't they? Yeah.
Yes.
Where you are. Yeah.
That's right. So it is my pleasure now to go to our next speaker, Moti Harari. And just like Jeff, Moti has, he's a person that makes, that basically makes these things happen, that he can make things grow where maybe they shouldn't grow. And let me just say a little bit, all of these bios, by the way, are in the website. So I'm not going to go and read the bios. I'm just going to say a few things. But Moti, as Sherry said, lives in an area that I think gets 2 inches of rain a year, the Negev Desert of southern Israel. And there's a group of kibbutz that exist in this area. About 5,000 people live here that basically produce about 60% of the food, of the vegetables that are eaten in Israel. So these folks which are not connected to the water system of Israel and which really have no soil have figured out how to be a model of an area that survives and in the most inhospitable of areas in the world. Moti is the head researcher of the flower garden. And he again is interested in things like perfumes, medicinal substances, flower production and breeding. And they've developed some evergreen pomegranate varieties that they export. He's lived in the Philippines and in Thailand, where he oversaw 30,000 farmers and 1,000 metric tons of fruit and vegetables before he moved to the Negev. So Moti, my pleasure to have you today, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Good evening, everybody. Here is evening, I don't know, you are morning. I would like to present a project I've done in Turkana, in northern Kenya. It's an area that is one of the, I've done more than 50 projects, development projects worldwide, but this is really the most complicated project I've done. It's a project that we've done together with the missionary community of St. Paul the Apostle in Kenya and Spain, and together with the Jewish National Fund and the Arava Center for Sustainable Development. We are the Turkana is a desert. We have about 300 millimeters of rainfall. And when I was asked to go there, we found out that there was never been any agricultural production in this area. And I made a survey and found out that the constraints in this area is really, really complicated. Know-how of desert agriculture. We live in one of the most extreme deserts in the world. We have 45 centigrades. We have 3,500 millimeters of evaporation a year. We have in our area we have very low relative humidity, and we are far away from the markets, and the water that we use coming from deep wells, and they are saline, and they are limited, and they are expensive. So when I came there, and the idea was to develop special agriculture that is suitable to this location. And what we have there is alkaline soil and water, pH of over 9. The soil is clay, heavy clay soil, Montmorillonite clay type, and which does not percolate. The plots that we have developed were the only green spots in the area as a magnet for insect, goats, and men. And what is there is that every 3 years there is a drought. And in this case, 50% of the animals that they live on are dying, and 15–20% of the people die from starvation, and especially old people and infant. There are also a heavy wind storm that bring sand particles that really devastate the crop. So we came there and we found out, we tried to develop a system, a comprehensive system. The idea was to build a sustainable system, and we started by building a training center, and to develop what we called forests in the desert. We brought groups of 15 people from Turkana. They are illiterate. They never worked, not only in agriculture, they never worked before. They were shepherds, grazing goats, and they never stay in the same place. When they're wandering with the goats to look for some fodder, and we brought them there for a period of 6 months. In these 6 months, we trained them by a group of Israeli volunteers that we trained them before in desert agriculture practices. We built a central farm. In the central farm, we made experiments selecting crops that are suitable to these conditions, and the agrotechnology that we build together. For example, we use a family drip system which can irrigate 500 square meters without the need of energy, because there is no energy available there. And the area, every farmer, every trainee got a plot that he grew 2 types of vegetable crops. And the idea is to provide them for food for their families, and also for marketing as an income generation activity for the local. They never had any income. They never had any source of income. And the idea is that from 500 square meters, growing 3–4 crops a year, they can feed the family, and also they get some product for sale. In this area, for example, there are no roads, there are no electricity, there is no internet connection, no phone, no cellular coverage, and the Israelis that the volunteers live on the farm next to a Catholic missionary that gives them really the security. We gave them practical training, and we are after 6 months, when they finish the training, we send them to an area that we develop some source of water, mainly small boreholes for about 50 to 90 meters, or air span that we dug and that collect rainwater. And we are giving them small equipment like drip irrigation, like some seeds, fertilizers, and some tools. And we use, after they start to work, we used to visit them periodically, between 7 to 10 days. We used to visit every plot to continue to help them, to assist them, to advise them, and also if they have any problems, they could send a message by people that are walking, send a message to us, and we used to visit them. The idea was to develop certain crops that can resist these conditions. And we found out that there are some varieties of plants like cucurbita, like watermelon, like melons, like that stand this condition. Also, other crops like maize, like other crops. Onions, for example, were very successful there. And we today, I can say that we completed 15 courses like this. And there are now about 350 farms like this. And 70% of the graduates continue to work on their field, which was higher than what I expected at the beginning. And to find in Africa sustainable project that continue for now it's about we started at the year 2010. Now it's 11 years, and we continue. We develop we train local Turkana to be the guides, to be the advisors. We also build an organization that every farm, every graduate is a member. He pays fee to be part of the project, and they deal with importing all the required inputs, because there is nothing there. There is no shops. There is no everything you have to bring from Nairobi, which is 5 days by truck. And also when they have to go to market, they don't have any public transportation or any private transportation. So our trainers, when they go with the pickup truck to visit, they take the surplus product and they bring them to the central market, which is about 120 kilometers far from the area that we work. And I can say that it is really fascinating, because we have to develop a completely new agrotechnology. To give you one example, since the soil is heavy soil and does not percolate, and so even when we give water, they don't go to the root system. So what we've done, we developed some kind of soilless culture. We dug canals in the plot. In the canal, we put sand from the valleys, and mix it with compost they produce. And on top of it, we put the drip irrigation. And with this, we get very successful crops. I can say that, I can proudly say that some of the yields that they are getting are equal to what we get in the Arava Valley. So the first stage was to produce nutritious food to the families and also to the school. We produce protein-rich product. One of the ideas that we consider is to have food with a lot of vitamins and minerals, because basically the Turkana people live on meat, milk, and blood. They never used any vegetables or fruits because there is nothing there. So one of the things in the course, we had to teach them how to cook, how to not only to grow, how to consume vegetables and fruits. And this was the first phase. The first phase was to produce vegetables and protein-rich food. And the second phase was to go to fruit trees, because fruit trees can really help in to be them stable on the same site. They will not leave the plot and go with the goats or with the zebos and leave the farm. When they have fruit trees, then it means that they are stable there and they take care of it. So so this is a picture of the central farm. You can see that we use you can see the simple family drip system. This system cost $120 for a plot of 500 square meter, and you can use. It does not need it. All what you have is a tank. Here is 90 liter, valve and a filter, and laterals, and very simple. You can put in the tank also fertilizers, and you can use it. These are a typical plot of the farm. Here we can see the system that I was talking about, digging canals and filling it with sand and compost, and this is what we do. We teach them everything from land preparation to post-harvest systems, and you can see there, for the first time in their life, they got some certificate when they graduate the course. We develop four types of plots. One is the subsistence commercial agricultural plot of 500 square meter. You can see here and here. And the second one is a variety of fruit trees. What we grow there is, you see, so tomatoes, eggplant, chilies, which were not so successful because of the alkalinity. What was more successful was the watermelon, melon, cucumber, squash and pumpkin, onion and garlic, sorghum. All these grain grow very well, especially okra, which is a staple food now there, cassava, which is also rich in protein, and we started growing fruit trees, moringa, pomegranate, and dates. We taught them how to store the seeds. For example, this is a method that we developed. It's called the double tanks. In the lower tank, we put the seeds, and on the upper one, we put fresh leaves. The fresh leaves consume the oxygen and produce CO2. CO2 is heavier than air, so it goes down, and the oxygen is coming out to the upper tank. And with this, we don't have any insects. We don't have the seeds does not breathe, so we can store seeds very in a very good condition for at least 1 year. So these are some of the seeds. Another method that we are using is called liman. Liman is excavating plot that is surrounded by high land, and the rainwater are coming to this plot, and it is stored. So instead of having only 300 millimeters in the liman, we have about 1,500 millimeters, equal to 1,500 millimeters of water. And in this, we can grow crops year-round, and without the use of irrigation. So this is a system that the Nabatean in Israel 2,000 years ago have developed this system, and we introduced it to Turkana. And now, besides the crop production, limans were built by the Jewish National Fund to grow trees in this desert, because there are no trees in this area, because all the trees were cut for fuel wood. So now the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, is financing limans to produce, to grow trees for fodder and for fuel wood. So in very short and really concise, we can speak about 10 years of work that we have introduced there, and we can say at the last, if I need to summarize, I can say that I'm very proud to have a project that is sustainable, that have really will continue to develop, because we succeeded to build a system that will include the local people, the know-how that we have, know-how in desert agriculture that we are practicing and researching in where I work in the Southern Arava R&D. And we are very happy to share this with other people in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moti. This is it's miraculous, really. We're running short on time, so I hope you can stay around till the end of this, because there are going to be a million questions. But I'd just like to remind everybody that Moti has done 3 things. He didn't say it this way, but one of them is a culture change, which is always very difficult, driven by technology. But he's also helped biodiversity, because there's always been a battle between these folks and the zebras around there. And if these people can make a living some other way, and they don't have to kill the zebras, that's always good for biodiversity. Moti is truly incredible. Thank you. So let's move on to the next presentation by Joel. And Joel is another one of these sort of heroes of mine. Joel started his career in the Philippines, ended up at NASA doing a postdoc there as well. his interest is in modern agricultural techniques around the world. And I think at the moment, even though he is a specialist at the University of Arizona in the strategies in semi-arid environments, he's back in the Philippines with what we know today as vertical farms. So he can do the range of meteorology and grow stuff under any condition, it seems. So Joel, thank you for joining us today, and we're all looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. All right, I'm just gonna go right into this. We're addressing this morning, of course, our urgent planetary grand challenge, which is food. And Jeff Silbert just mentioned that in the next 30 years, by 2050, global population will be about 9.7 billion. That, by the way, is tantamount to adding another Africa and another Europe to our current level of population. So that's really serious. So the United Nations projects that to be able to meet the food demand by 2050, we have to increase our food production by 70%. And in terms of crop production, we have to double it. But that is quite a tall order because crop production or food production already is responsible for 70% of all freshwater withdrawals worldwide. We're already using about half of all habitable land for food production. And food production and its supply chain consumes about 30% of all energy expenditures worldwide. So if we're going to double our crop production in the next 30 years, how are we going to do it, given that our inputs for crop production are already limiting? So the answer to that is yes, we can still use, of course, our traditional methods, our current methods, but in addition to that, we have to innovate. There is no choice. We have to innovate. And I just want to add that in terms of addressing our need for food security on the planet, we need a portfolio of solutions. So in other words, there's not a silver bullet solution. It has to be a combination, a suite, a portfolio of these solutions. So for the discussion this morning, I want to focus on these two game-changing innovations. These are high-tech innovations, vertical farming and cellular agriculture. I'm focusing on this just because they're really showing significant promise in terms of disrupting and impacting our food systems in the coming years, as well as in the coming decades. So let me start with vertical farming. By the way, I'm privileged to serve as vice chair of the International Association for Vertical Farming. So I'm quite familiar with the industry. Vertical farming has its origins from the space program of NASA, as well as the former Soviet Union. That's because the idea for the space program is to be able to send astronauts in the extraterrestrial environment of the moon or Mars for long duration crewed mission. So for Mars, we're talking about 2 years of residence on the surface. And that's in addition to 6 months of going there and 6 months of coming back. So really the astronauts have to have their own way of producing their food on site and being able to reuse and regenerate as much of the resources such as water and nutrients, pardon me. So I had the privilege of doing my postdoc ages ago at NASA Kennedy Space Center. And this is precisely the area that I worked on during that time, which is closed ecological life support system, which in other words is space farming. So for instance, this was the biomass production chamber, a demonstration system at Kennedy at that time. And in here, you're seeing wheat that are being grown hydroponically. So there's no soil involved. And this chamber is airtight, it's air sealed. So the temperature is controlled, relative humidity is controlled, the light intensity, quality, light duration, they're all controlled. So in other words, this enables the crops to really grow at optimum yield, productivity, as well as quality. I continued this work when I moved here to the University of Arizona. Japan was the very first country in the world, I would say, that really capitalized and commandeered this knowledge, this technology of space farming, and put that to use right here on Earth. And they refer to that as plant factories, which we now refer to as vertical farms. This was circa 2007. I was invited to visit this vertical farm near the airport, which was under construction at that time. So there are two paradigms for vertical farms. The first one is the warehouse type of vertical farm, which looks like this on the outside. This is the company spread in Japan. They're producing about 30,000 heads of lettuce per day. Now inside, it could look something like this, although this is a different company. This is Mirai, also in Japan. So here's what you see. You have these shelves where the crops are being grown. And the shelves are essentially arranged one on top of the other, which is why it's called a vertical farm. Again, this is in a closed warehouse type of building. Everything is controlled, the temperature, the relative humidity, the light level, the light intensity, even the light colors are designed to be able to optimize photosynthesis so that you can maximize your yield, your productivity, as well as the quality of the crops. The power of this arrangement is that you essentially become independent of geography, of the season, of the climate, of the weather. And you can grow the crops continuously 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This is an American company in the New York area Farms. This is Plenty in the Silicon Valley area. Another American company in the Silicon Valley area, Essence Grows. Bowery is another vertical farm in the New York area. So vertical farms are emerging and rising, certainly in North America, and also true in Europe, in parts of Asia as well. So these are the major benefits of vertical farms. They save 80 to 95% of water compared with open field cultivation. Arable lands technically is not needed because you're growing indoors. Requires significantly less land area because you're going upwards in terms of production. Less fertilizer because you keep on circulating the nutrients until they're used up. You don't need pesticides because it's a closed, clean environment. Consistently optimal productivity and crop quality, again, 24/7, 365 days a year, and independence in terms of location, climate, weather, and season. And it's also sustainability powered because you're saving a lot of water, a lot of land. And so I promulgated what I refer to as Quella's Law as an inspiration for the vertical farming industry, that productivity per unit resource use, meaning per liter of water, per kilowatt of energy, per kilogram nutrients, and so on and so forth, will have to increase exponentially over time. So crop productivity per unit resource use in a tech-dense vertical farm must double every 4 to 5 years. Again, this is aspirational, but we are requesting for data so that we can really monitor this if it is actually happening, and we hope that it is happening. So the second type or paradigm of vertical farm is the modular vertical farm. This is one company in Germany that has this modular unit that it is using and promoting, which can be interconnected like Lego blocks to be able to scale up the production. Here's another company, Urban Crop Solutions. They've got their own modules that they can even put one on top of another. And of course, the classic example is your ubiquitous shipping containers, because they're available everywhere on Earth, and the used ones can be retrofitted to be modular vertical farms, which is exactly what we did with my lab group at the University of Arizona. We purchased this used shipping container and retrofitted it so that we could grow crops inside as a demonstration of a modular vertical farm. But we also use this as a lab, really, to come up with our own original innovations for growing systems, such as the Beehive Green Box. I don't really have the time to focus on the details of this. The other one is the Go Vertical Farm, which is a live grow bot that can move around and therefore could minimize on the labor requirements. And at the same time, one could apply data analytics and artificial intelligence in this system so that when you collect your big data, your algorithm will be able to discern the appropriate and proper settings for each one of these environmental factors so that, again, you can maximize your productivity and yield. But not just that, but also the quality in terms of the flavor profile as well as the nutrient profile of the crop that you are growing. So again, this is just a repetition of all of those benefits that vertical farming offers. Now we go to the second innovation, which is cellular agriculture. It's also known as cultivated meat or plant-based meat. So in terms of animal production since 1961, the global meat production has more than quadrupled to more than 340 million tons. And so this directly translated into the intensification of animal agriculture. And that is known as the concentrated agricultural feeding operations. So in other words, animals are cramped together in a certain area, and that's where they're kept, that's where they're raised, that's where they're fed, and sometimes that's where they die as well. Now, when animals are really this close together, when one gets sick, it's very easy for the contagion to spread throughout the entire herd. And that's a bad situation. And so what growers do to prevent that is to inject the animals with antibiotics. So not surprisingly, about 65% of antibiotics in the United States are sold for use on farms. Now, only 37% of the global protein supply actually comes from meat and dairy. And yet, more than 75% of land used for food production goes to animal agriculture. And that's not just the space where the animals are actually grown, but that's the space required for growing the crops that are needed to formulate the feed for these animals. About a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions are traceable to the food supply chain. And animal agriculture accounts for about 3/4 of those emissions. So growing livestock really is a bit problematic in those particular senses. And this is where cultivated meat comes in, again, known as cultured meat or clean meat. This is Mark Post, a professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He was the one that pioneered the idea of, instead of growing whole animals, why don't we just grow cells extracted from the animals? We mass produce the cells in the lab and ultimately in bioreactors, in warehouses, and then reconstitute them and add other ingredients so that you can come up with your final meat products. So he presented this in 2013. The advantages of this is that by doing it this way, rather than the traditional livestock production, you're gonna have 95% less greenhouse gas emissions, 98% less land use, and 50% less energy inputs. So now there are companies that have jumped into this opportunity. One is Memphis Meats, that is based in San Francisco. It's one of the pioneers. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks to grow these cells in bioreactors. And at that time in 2013, since this was a prototype, 1 pound of beef cost about $18,000. But fast forward 5 years later, in 2018, they were able to bring it down to $11 per pound. And of course, it's been 2 years since 2018. So I am sure that there's been significant stride made as well in lowering down the cost. Just so you know, the reason as to why this is very expensive is because of the liquid medium, the growing medium that's used for growing the cells. But now they've really been able to modify it and optimize it so that now the growing medium is much cheaper. In my group at the University of Arizona, we've designed so far 6 original photobioreactors. 3 of them have been patented, 3 are pending in terms of their patents, and they've all been licensed to this company, Algae Cell, which is a startup company in Tucson. They are going to be used for algae production. However, they can be used as well for other types of cells, including meat cells. And again, investors are now pouring into this space, including Tyson, which is the largest meat processor. It's not just beef, but chicken as well. And Eat Just is a company in Singapore, and they're producing this cultured chicken meat, and they were the first one that received official approval from their governments. Plant-based meats, I'm sure you're more familiar with this, the Impossible Burger. So this is a so-called a meat product, but it's not really made of meat. It's made of plant ingredients, mimicking the taste, the flavor, the texture of a meat product. So again, these are the powerful benefits of this innovation: significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and so on and so forth. So there is a potential downside or unintended consequence of having this high-tech innovations for food, and that they could significantly widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots among nations in food, given their large discrepancies in scientific and technical capabilities. Now, since we are having this webinar here in the context of science diplomacy, this really here is a powerful rationale for us engaging in science diplomacy so that there could be sharing in terms of innovation and technologies. I just want to share 3 quick cases of my global engagement for food security. So these are the countries in the Middle East I've been involved with and are still involved with. Now, focusing on the Gulf Cooperation Council, they are the most wealthy countries, Arab countries in the Middle East. However, they are food insecure. They're importing 60 to 90% of their food stuff. And this is an index for food, water, energy that was developed by Cardi Rand Grad School. For comparison, the US is 0.94 because the US is really quite food secure as a country. But you can see the much lower scores for these wealthy Arab countries, one of which is Qatar. And I was invited by the Qatar National Food Security Program a few years back. And they asked me to form a team, and I serve as a PI to design for them this demo farm that involves vertical farming and algae production and other innovations, but in such a way that it's a closed loop system so that, again, the nutrients, the energy are conserved within the system. I'm collaborating now with the Quranic Botanic Garden, which is part of the Qatar Foundation, since they're interested in modular vertical farms. I just want to note here that global capacity building in food security requires far more than just sharing technology innovation. My work with the West Bank in Palestine, I've been involved there long-term with Palestine Polytechnic University in terms of teaching and research. However, about 4 years ago, I got invited in Ramallah by the government. This is the Higher Council for Innovation and Excellence. They discussed with me one of their challenges, which is the escalating price of animal feed in the West Bank, which could prove prohibitive for a lot of their farmers. I'll be done in 2 minutes. And so we agreed that the solution would be growing spirulina, which is a protein-rich algae, as an ingredient for their animal feed. However, I strongly recommended to them that this not be just a regular academic research project, but this be a partnership between government, which is the Higher Council, a university, and also a member of the industry, so that this becomes a sustainable program. The university that was chosen was Al-Quds Open University, and I got a chance to help them set up their lab and train some of their staff. The company that was chosen is Aziza, which is a feed manufacturer in Palestine. And so now they're all working together and establish this joint center of excellence for strategic arid land, food, and bioproduction. 1 minute. The Philippines, I originally came from the Philippines. So unfortunately, the Philippines has become one of the epicenters for feeling the brunt of the impact of a changing climate. They have a lot of superstorms going through the country. And a lot of the farmers are complaining that there's now excessive heat and excessive rain, that a lot of the vegetables cannot be grown outside. They have to be grown in some kind of an indoor structure. And so that's where I come in terms of designing a frugal engineered indoor farming system for them. And the way that we are approaching this is using this philosophy of strategic agriculture, where we connect the farmers to all of the inputs and outputs as well that they need for their business enterprise to really be viable, which is really important in addressing food security, particularly in emerging economies. These are farmers associations, so I'm going to be working with them in this particular province in developing appropriate modular units for vertical farms. And lastly, I was contacted recently by the Department of Agriculture of the Philippines. Given my expertise in vertical farming, they requested me to advise them in terms of their urban agriculture program, which will be implemented initially in the National Capital Region, but ultimately throughout the Philippines. I will send you a copy of this presentation so you can review this. But in terms of capacity building for food security, again, I just want to emphasize it's not just the technology that matters, but all the other matters, all the other aspects as well are needed for a successful program. There's my email, and feel free to contact me. Thank you very much. Back to you, Joaquin.
Joe, thank you very much. As you can see, all of our speakers have unbridled enthusiasm, and it's terrific. We finished today with Kim Ogden. One of the points that everybody's made is that without water, we're sort of in big trouble with respect to any innovation that has to do with growing food. So Kim, who I also greatly admire, has worked a lot on algae production. First, it was about biofuels. I'm not exactly sure where her algae work is these days, but she has very innovative programs that have to do with cleaning up water. And today, Kim is going to tell us about that, I suspect, how it's been used in the Navajo region, which is another area in the world right in our back door here in Arizona, that also is in big trouble with food security. Kim is the chair of the chemical engineering program at the U of A. I think I got that right. And I give you the microphone, Kim. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Joaquin. I'm taking a little different approach because this was a little more last minute for me. So thank you for having me. But I'm kind of presenting a lot of things that other people have been involved with here, because as Joel pointed out, these are very complex problems and we really need to work as teams. So I'm going to give you some types of things that we worked with. I'm going to show you some innovations that our students actually do. So I'll be highlighting some student work today. So a lot of my co-presenters here are actually graduate students that we work with. So just a little bit, I always like to just let everybody know my background and where I came from. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York. Outside of Rochester, which was pretty much a farming community. It was very small, dairy and chicken farms primarily. And then the other farming was more to feed those animals. Then I was tired of the little town and ended up at the University of Pennsylvania right in downtown Philadelphia. Then I moved west and to Colorado. Did a little bit of time in Los Alamos, where this is where between Colorado and Los Alamos really started getting interested in biological processes and integrated systems. And then I've been at the U of A for quite a while. So I'm going to talk to you today about a couple of different projects, and one is off the grid energy, water, food system. So it's very complementary, as Joel pointed out, that we need a lot of different solutions for a lot of different places, and there is not one solution fits all. We want to work together on a variety of different solutions. And then Kevin Fitzsimmons is a colleague of all of ours here, and he was nice enough to send me a couple slides so I could tell you about other integrated systems, which are aquaponic systems that Kevin does, so we can just highlight some of the cool solutions that we're doing across the world. So as Joaquin pointed out, one of the groups that we've been working with is the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is the largest Native American land here, largest landmass nation in the United States. The population's a little under or around 200,000, and it's continuing to grow. But they are very spread out community. So they have very remote communities, and they're spread out at less than 10 people per mile. They essentially have valued the land their whole life. And so to not over farm it too much, that's why they're very spread out, but then it gives different issues because of that being spread out. It's hard to get them all onto grid or have running water in their homes. And so today we're talking kind of about how the food desert is here. 51, there's like some small towns there, and one of them is called Hard Rock. And 51% of the population in this little town go and buy their food off of the nation. So there isn't enough food on the nation to be able to support themselves. And some of it has been from overgrazing. So we work right with the community, because build it and they will come is never a solution. So if you do not work right with your communities, as everyone knows, they're not going to continue to implement the types of things. So we have an integrated approach here. So a couple years ago, we wrote for the National Science Foundation, and we got a training grant. And the person in charge of the training grant is Carletta Chief here. She's the PI on the grant, and she is Navajo. And she's our leader in this effort. And we do a lot of integrated energy, water, food systems working on this. So there's Carletta, who's in environmental sciences and is teamed with electrical engineers, chemical engineers, environmental engineers, biosystems engineers, so that we can look at integrated systems. And so this training grant trains graduate students. So that's what I'm going to talk to a little bit today, that we're getting them to understand intercultural awareness, how to get a more diverse workforce, how do we learn from each other, about solar energy and how you use that in greenhouse to make food and so forth. So it's a very integrated process, and all of the students involved go through a specialized training to understand how to work with different cultures on energy, water, food security, and sovereignty. And I'm going to give you an example of a couple of the projects that the students have done. So at the end of the project, and actually Dr. Joel teaches one of the classes in their minor as well. But the last thing that they do is a interdisciplinary project design course. And I'm going to share with you some of the really cool solutions the students come up with. So here are the 4 students from a variety of disciplines. So we have a chemical engineer, a biosystems. Nikki, I think, is moved. She switched majors. I don't remember which one she's in, but she's in College of Agriculture. And then Michael is in material science. So this is the types of teams that we get. And what we want them to do is to come up with ideas that involve culture and sovereignty for the Navajo Nation, and how they could implement new things on the nation. And so Nikki is a Native American. And so she was very good at thinking about Navajo culture and Navajo language. So the Navajo language is very challenging for people that don't know it. It's a very complex language. And the thing that is one of the reasons it's complex, as much as I understand it, which isn't too much, is that each word is more like a little definition. So their words are longer to do this. And so they're working on some of the Navajo language and how it incorporates into their circle of life. And they're also very directional. And I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. So one of the things that this team came up with is, okay, what's an integrated off-the-grid energy, water, food system that could be used? So they have a water source from both rain and from wells. Their wells are pretty deep. Collecting water, then we can do some microfiltration to clean up that water. They do have some issues with water there from mining. There is some uranium and arsenic quite a bit in their water. Then using a greenhouse design to actually grow food and have that be powered by solar with some backup batteries. And so the greenhouse can have some solar power as well as the water filtration system. So the coolest thing about this is why I love working on this course with the students, is what they decided to do is come up with a solar Hogan teaching greenhouse for one of the communities on the Navajo. It's in the shape of a Hogan, and a Hogan is an octagonal house, which is many of the Navajo live in Hogans. That's their traditional house. As I said, it's very directional. So you always enter the Hogan from the east. And it's pointed to, the door is pointed to where the sun rises. And then you design things in a circular motion as they kind of think about their lives and daily living. So this is kind of a very cool way to integrate technologies and culture to come up with some of the sorts of things that Joel showed. You can do some vertical farming, raised beds in there. You put in an aquaponics system. You have, places where you grow seeds and so forth. So it's kind of an idea that they're doing. And hopefully at some point, this will be like a funded project so they could actually build this particular greenhouse on the Navajo Nation. The other thing, as Joaquin pointed out, that we work on quite a bit is really thinking about the water systems and how do we get water to a lot of people that are off the grid. And the water, of course, can be used for agriculture and for just normal everyday household use. So we have a few different systems, and this is the work primarily of Dr. Vicky Carancola. And what we have here are a couple of off-the-grid water systems that we deploy to the nation. So this one here is a water system that does more like 1,000 to 15,000 gallons per day. It has a solar panel on it, and so the solar panel provides enough energy to be able to run the pumps and things to filter the water so that you can have clean water on this other side. This one here is deployed at Dene College, which is the tribal college on the Navajo Nation, and it's like a training system so that a lot of people could be trained on how to use this. We try to make these actually as simple as possible using off-the-shelf stuff, filters and so forth, but they are a little tricky to run if you want them to continuously produce clean water. And so we have a big training program that goes along with this, with videos, and we go to Dene College and train people and so forth. And then the newest one is a smaller system, 50 to 100 gallons per day, which is a little off the grid system that has some solar panels that aren't shown there, that you can have it for kind of 2 to 3 households that might be in a little cluster together on the nation. And these were you have to pair with the nation. So we're working with Dig Deep, which is a group that works with them, and us and some other people are working together. So with that solar nanofiltration, the second time we ran our class, then it's like, well, how can we improve these units? And so we asked some students, what would you do? How would you make this particular off-the-grid solar nanofiltration system work better? Students, again, being very innovative. It's like, well, why are we just doing, well water? Why don't we couple rain harvesting and solar nanofiltration so that we can, again, work on the real issues in the energy that are important for the Navajo people. And again, they looked at some of the cultural aspects. It's like, okay, well, to do this, we really need to think about how they respect the earth and the spirituality to be able to work together so that they would implement this type of solution. And so what they've done is it's got the regular solar nanofiltration unit and some well water, but it's like, why wouldn't we just do storage as well? And there's a lot of advantages to this. So if you rain harvest and harvest your water, if you combine the rainwater with the pumping groundwater or from the wells, then your filters and things are going to last for a lot longer time. It's better. They just they can last for longer periods of time. So that's a little bit on those particular types of things that I wanted to share with you. And then I'm just going to briefly talk to you about other solutions, which would be aquaponics type solutions. We've talked a lot about fruits and vegetables and things like that, but we also have severe problems with overfishing. And this work is Kevin Fitzsimmons, and he's one of our colleagues that works all over the world. And, there's just less and less fish in the oceans, and that's a problem. So he's developed systems, aquaponics type systems, where you have aquaculture, so fish, hydroponics, your vegetables, and microbial communities that help recycle your nutrients. You need all of them. And so it's very cool because they're very integrated systems. So what these are is you have like tanks for raising fish like tilapia. Kevin really likes tilapia. You have kind of a filtration system with some pumps and so forth. You might need to add some gassing if they're producing too much. You might have to adjust pH. And then you use your microbial community and the roots and so forth to be able to grow a lot of vegetables right in these particular houses. So you're making fish and you're making vegetables at the same time. And there's these types of things across the United States where they have integrated systems for salmon and lettuce. He also is very into working right with the rural communities. Here is a group where they're making these integrated systems in Mexico. And you can see them after they're planting and working with the community here. And in the end, successful peppers and fish. And he works, of course, in other places like Bangladesh. And I just wanted to thank some of the funding that we have to do all these different projects. And so with that, I will stop sharing and I'll be happy to join the panel for questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all. This has been, frankly, one of the most invigorating series of talks I've heard in a long time. And it really shows how the U of A, for obvious reasons, is right at the forefront of many of the innovations that we're going to need if we're going to make this a more just world in the future. I have a question that I want to start this with, and it goes to Moti, because I think one of the most challenging things, and Kim pointed that out, dealing with the Navajos, and the same would be all over Africa, is the cultural aspect of coming from a subsystem to something that has more food security. And I was totally amazed that, this question is not mine, but I was amazed anyway, how you were able to change the culture of the people in Turkana to make them eat vegetables.
First of all, my partners in this project is the community, the Catholic missionaries. They are the only organization that work there. There is no government activity there because the Turkana are very weak and small, relatively small tribe in a tribal society like Kenya. So nobody really helps them besides these missionaries that build schools. And in the school, they supply the children with one hot meal a day from food that we grow in the project. And it comes back to the family, to the parents, and especially when they started to eat watermelon, this was the starting point, because watermelon is sweet, it is juicy, and they love it. And from there, they started to use vegetables that we trained them in the course how to cook, and we gave them to taste, and they like it, and they understand the value. We preaches the value of eating vegetables and minerals and vitamins, and it spread out.
That's incredible. Does anybody else want to add? I mean, Jeff, you've been at it for a long time, trying to work with all kinds of size of communities so that they get engaged in what you consider to be best practices, but they may not consider them to be best practices. And Kim is the same way.
Right.
I think Joel is more in the sort of stratosphere, and he goes straight to the people that have the money. And so you don't have to worry about these cultural changes. But Jeff and Kim, do you have anything to add here to that?
Well, I would say briefly, I was impressed with what Modi and his colleagues had accomplished there as well, because that is like the critical step. You have the people that you work with have to have confidence in you. And quite often what they see from experts and like people from the university is a one hit and gone kind of event where people come out, show them what they have, say, here's, look at us from the university. I will see you all later. And they split. But what you have to do is establish a relationship and establish trust. And also too, working in a lot of rural communities, what I found is interesting is that you can have different societies, different languages, different nations, very different people, but there's a commonality in people in rural areas, farmers and people working in rural agricultural communities, is that they have a tendency to be very committed once they develop that trust, but it takes a while. You can take a decade to develop that kind of confidence, trust, relationships. You can lose it in about 10 minutes if you're not careful. So they count on you to be honest, sincere. But you know what Moti was describing, I find is very important in our experience as well. You have to be on the ground, being there with them, and it's a fundamental piece of it. That's a genius, really, in the extension system we work with here in Arizona, in the United States, have it here in Arizona that I've worked with. We have people living, working in the communities, and those people form the bonds with relationships with people in communities. And that's really the first step forward. So it's a lot of sociology and a lot of anthropology, on the ground, dealing with the implementation of science. So I 100% agree.
Yeah, I would just agree with Jeff. It's they're with the Navajo, they had, because of the pandemic, everybody has had to get a little bit more technology, but they still do some technology. They're in parking lots and stuff sometimes to get on internet and whatever. Right. And we'll do some things, but it's just the week I spend there, before pandemic, whatever, a week, a quarter or something, you just seem to get so much more done. They just are a face-to-face group, and you just really need to be there working with the people continuously, as Jeff pointed out.
Joaquin, if I may add, you're right. I mean, it's not possible to remove the human factor in these projects, which may be, construed as a technical project. And in reality, I've spent a lot of time on the ground. In all these places that I'm working in. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, we talk directly with farmers. And one thing that I discovered in Saudi Arabia is that the farmers are already organized according to their villages. So they have village associations, which I found really quite powerful, because that means that they have the economy of scale and they can share resources between families. And that is great. Now, if you go to the Philippines, a lot of the farmers there are smallholder farmers, and they're usually autonomous. They're operating as a family unit. And so it's very important to introduce the idea of farmers associations or cooperatives in the countryside in the Philippines. And that's not a natural for a lot of them. And so by having this relationship with them over extended period of time, and thankfully, again, that governor in that particular province that I had a chance of being acquainted with, he's already done this. And so that becomes like a pattern that I'm using now for everybody else that I'm interacting in other parts of the Philippines as an example. Again, to kind of to shift their perspective, to enable them to gain economy of scale and be competitive in the local economy, and hopefully internationally as well going forward.
So go ahead, Moti, sorry.
When we talk about the food shortage in the future, the point to work is in Africa. There is huge areas. Most of the people there are smallholders with a very low level of agriculture, and the production is very low. I think that with focus on this smallholder, we can make a change in the whole food supply chain for the world. And I can quote one genius American professor that said that what we need is to take a B-29, put it loaded with phosphorus fertilizer, and spread it all over Africa. This will make the difference in food production.
So now, if you go to the high tech end of the questioning here, the webinar before yours, none of you actually addressed this, but the webinar before yours, the people in the UN that have been worrying about about food production and equality, there was a fair amount of discussion about GMOs and CRISPR as gene editing. That's not a GMO, but for those that don't understand it, it's a different thing. You're not adding some foreign DNA into the food, but you're editing the DNA. So there was dismay about the Europeans' view of GMO and now their view on CRISPR, because they felt that would not benefit the world. But my question to you is, at the level, maybe Joe would have a different answer, but I'd like to hear all of your answers. At the level of the stuff that you're dealing with, like Moti, you with Africa, and Kim, you with the Navajos, and even you, Jeff, with rural area, how important at this point is worrying about GMOs and CRISPR, or focusing more in the kinds of solutions that you've come up with where gene editing is not an issue, or maybe it is?
I'm working a lot in India, and all the problem with the GMO started in India with the cotton, that they didn't want the GMO cotton that is resistant to the pink caterpillar, and I really don't understand. Besides, because they had to purchase the seeds from the company and not to produce their own seeds. I think that I can give you an example. When you go to Africa and you see the number of people who suffer from glaucoma, and less of they don't have vitamin A, enough vitamin A level. And when you have this maize with enriched with vitamin A by this GMO system, I don't understand how can we oppose to use this system in order to really to help the people, to cure them from this disease. So I'm for this GMO. Of course, be cautious, but there are points that really I don't understand why to oppose the GMO.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I will offer my echo my support of those same comments. I've had the opportunity since 1990, when GMOs were first introduced in the field of the United States in an experimental format that came out of the greenhouse and laboratory. Fast forward ahead to where we are today, 31 years later. I mean, the technology has been tested, it's safe, it's good technology. And this is a great example of where we have good science and technology, but communicating that effectively into the certain segments of the public can be a real challenge. It's ironic, it's particularly a challenge in the more affluent, educated segments of the planet. Now, I've spoke pretty directly to my work here in Arizona and in the United States, but I've worked internationally as well, particularly in these arid and semi-arid regions. And it's striking to me the tremendous need we have for technology. This is good technology to use, and it's just appalling sometimes that the kind of forces that come back, oftentimes from the educated and more affluent countries and populations, that push back on this. They have the luxury of doing that. But as Moti said, people in other parts of the world and in more impoverished areas really need the technology and the help, fundamental technology. We don't have to have a lot of infrastructure. It's genetically driven, and it can be tremendously beneficial in a lot of ways. So that's one of our challenges. And again, it comes back to educating and dealing with people. The science be damned if you can't communicate and work with the communities to effectively in that educational process. That's really what we come down to. It's a challenge. It's a huge challenge for us. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Joaquin, it's a complex issue. I'd like to cite the case of the Philippines, for instance, particularly with eggplant. It's a Bt eggplant. So Bt is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a common soil bacterium, and there's a gene from that bacterium that's been spliced into the eggplant to confer it with insect resistance. The problem of eggplant farmers in the Philippines is that because of the changing climate, it's more rainfall and it's warmer, the eggplants become infested with all types of insects and pests. And really, the only effective way of doing that in terms of what's available to them is to spray them with loads and loads of pesticides, which is harmful to people, harmful to the environment. And so that is why the BT eggplant has been introduced in the Philippines, but it's been very controversial, although I think that the government has now officially approved it. So for people in the developing world, GMO is not a bad deal for them. They welcome it. But of course, I realize that not everybody in the globe is in favor of that. But a lot of people in the developing world don't have the luxury of refusing it. But science has shown that really it is safe, at least in terms of what we know today.
Yeah, well, Jeff reminds me that sometimes the most, I don't want to use educated because I don't think they are, but the people that theoretically are educated are the most obstreperous about these sorts of things. The anti-vaxxers are another example.
Exactly. It's an ironic challenge that we have in that respect, but it's certainly there. There's been millions of metric tons of GMO corn that's been sent to Africa that has been rejected by African nations because they've been influenced by some of the European nations and some nonprofit organizations that say that it has GMO corn, you shouldn't take it, you should reject it. And so people end up suffering starvation and suffering from deprivation because they are rejecting good technology that's right at their fingertips because they've been misinformed. But the ones that are misinforming them are very effective in their educational efforts. And that's what we're up against, is how do we more effectively educate? I think it comes back to being on the ground, working with people in communities and demonstrating their technologies and working to gaining that sense of confidence, but it just takes a lot of time. It shouldn't be that hard, but it is.
Yeah. Now, here's another question, and this one, I've also wondered about this a lot. So there's a lot of discussion about not only the food production, and all of you have given some fantastic examples of how we can produce food better and have higher yields and so on. But there's a whole issue then of getting food to the right places, companies, how all that works, the role of middle people versus the outlets of food. And of course, this would be, I think, very different, maybe, and I'm wrong, but I think it would be very different in Africa. But in this country, I've always been amazed, and this is why I'm choosing this question from the audience. One of my neighbor, okay, who is one of these folks that imports food to the US, and Jeff, you must know him, James Jaime Chamberlain from Nogales. Well, anyway, he points out, he has this app, right? He always shows me this app where he can actually see how the people in central Mexico are packaging the zucchinis that are going to be coming to Walmart. But in the end, the driver of all of that is Walmart, Costco, Trader Joe's. They're the ones that demand not only what kind of vegetables, but the price of those vegetables. And all he's doing is trying to make it happen. But it's not, it's the power of these big outlets is extraordinary.
Right.
And the question then becomes, if that's just a thing in the US, or that actually then reverberates all throughout the world.
My experience is it reverberates throughout the world. And it's a good example. The consumer dictates the market. So the Walmarts, the Trader Joe's, these other large companies are basically responding to what consumers are asking for. And that's where I look at it a lot of times, is this disconnect. That's why the urbanization of our planet, I think, is important to consider. And so many people now are 1 or 2, 3 generations separated from food production systems, where we didn't have that problem, that challenge, you'd say, in most parts of the world 50, 60 years ago, 80 years ago. But we certainly do now, particularly in the post-World War II era. We have major segments of the population that have never been around. They really don't have a clue as to where things really come from. And that makes them susceptible to misinformation. But those become our consumers. and the Walmarts and the Trader Joe's and these large companies respond to. We work in a large vegetable production industry here, leafy green vegetable in the Southwest. And we say that all the time. Farmers are moving more and more towards different systems to satisfy those large shippers. We call them the shippers, the Walmarts, et cetera, and to be able to satisfy ultimately the consumer. So our challenge in education really is at the consumer level. And I think it starts K through 12 as we work with young people in terms of where does our food come from? What's the validity of science in here? But we have that problem, of course, with facts throughout every facet of our society today. But that's a good point. We see that as well in many of our industries I'm working with as well. Exactly what you described.
I'm sure Joel and Moti have something to say about that.
Yeah.
Well, I was working in Sri Lanka when the riot started, when the civil war started. The first thing, they went out and they killed all the Mudelelis, all the middlemen. They killed 150 in one day. This was the first outbreak of the system because they are hated so much. But this is a problem all over. It is in Israel. It's all over. It's controlled by the big supermarket chains, and the farmers really are not organized enough to compete and to really to fight against it. It's a matter of organizing and organizing the farmers to work together and to be really the leading power against the control of the big supermarket chains. But it does not work this way. In Israel, farmer is getting about 2 shekel per kilo of tomatoes, and in the supermarket it's sold by 8 shekel. The same tomatoes. So this is the way.
Yeah. Joel.
Yes, so this is touching on the matter of global trade, and I am not against global trade at all. Yes, this has been going on for some time now, for the last few decades, and actually it benefits everybody, even American farmers, for instance. The United States is the biggest exporter of grains, be it corn or wheat, to the rest of the world. I guess the biggest competitor would be Brazil. But the US is a big supplier of grains to China, for instance, among other countries. So it certainly benefits American farmers. And the good thing about those farmers in the developing world, for instance, since they've been plugged into the global trade, it's really given them opportunity to advance and to become profitable and even have improvements in their quality of life. So I'm all for this. And I don't think that's going to go away, global trade in food and agriculture. What I'm advocating, though, is, again, in terms of the principle of indoor farming or vertical farming, is that it allows food production to become more local. So here in the United States, particularly in the winter time, majority of the green vegetables actually are exported from Arizona to the rest of the country. But that is not so resilient as a food distribution system, because when disruptions happen, be it economic shocks or caused by the pandemic, there could be some disruption so that the distribution might be cut off or delayed. And that could result in some food insecurity for some places, even within the US. So what I'm advocating for is, again, indoor farming, vertical farming that allows for some local production of produce, perhaps not right in the city, but around the city. And that would mitigate some of those shocks that could be felt because of a lot of factors. So in the end, I would see it as a combination of global trade as well as localized production. But the cat is out of the bag in terms of global trade. It's never going to go away. And it's been a positive force for the world in the last 30, 40 years, particularly.
I agree. But I'm becoming more and more of a regionalist, and just because I don't know what I'm talking about. But I think that if you take this farm to table concept, in which vertical farms would be sort of central, maybe you can do in the cities the same miracle that Moti did in Kenya, and that's educate people about what they should be eating.
Right.
It's now the other way around, isn't it? Anyway.
Well, I think also as we understand the systems more and things as well, right? So as vertical farming comes down a little bit in cost, then we can think about, once a lot of the infrastructure is in place and that kind of stuff, then you can think about the transportation issues and the life cycle assessments of these things and, look at the economics, and it will start to catch up, right? There's a bit of a cash outlay, right? I believe, Joel, make these buildings and so forth. So as that continues to improve and we get better and more productivity in our vertical farms and all that kind of stuff, that then the transportation will be the other flip side of it. And in the, I don't know, it's still, fresh produce always stays still a lot better than when they ship it up from wherever in the global market, right? A tomato is not a tomato and a strawberry is not a strawberry depending on the time of year that you get them. So I think once we start on the systems and understand the system analysis and look at the life cycles and things of these of where we're at, that will move the needle a little bit farther, and we can be more regionalist, as you say, Joaquin.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things that come to mind as a third world country person. I was born in Mexico and lived there most of my life. And yesterday I was speaking to somebody from Chile, and he was pointing out that in Chile there are apples everywhere. And that when he was a child, there used to be these horse-drawn things with people yelling, apples, apples, and they were selling apples. And that all these apples were just horrible looking. They were gnarly and they weren't very pretty, but they were absolutely delicious. And I remember in Mexico where I lived, it was an area that they grew a lot of cantaloupe. And as you well know, good cantaloupe really smells. It really is very powerful taste. And they actually had to change what they were selling for the US market because the US market didn't like the smelly, tasty cantaloupe, and they preferred something that tasted like straw. So it goes back to what we've sort of learned is good and bad. And boy, that's a different story. Anyway, I'm going to finish this off by just saying that this has been just truly amazing. And we should redo this. We should do a dog and pony show with all of you and go and describe what's happening around the world to policymakers and like this is supposed to happen. And maybe Sherry can make us do that because she is sort of central to that kind of world. But what you're doing is a great example of how we can all make this world better. Sherry, do you want a last word? I think she's still around.
I am still around. Let me just ask the question that came from a viewer who is talking about cybersecurity of food systems. So we've been talking about local grown food and the fact that vertical farms are, let's just say, operating on cyber. And then we're also talking about cybersecurity of transportation systems. So what are people doing about this?
Yeah, Sherry, that's an excellent question. And you're right, particularly with vertical farms in North America, in Europe, Japan, including China as well. There is a drive to collect data from all types of sensors that are distributed in the entirety of the vertical farm. And the idea for that is, again, to perform data analytics and artificial intelligence, but that's rich information. And they need to be made secure because then some parties could hack into it and cause troubles. And also in terms of perhaps damaging the operation or destroying the operation, which then becomes an issue, another issue of food security or food insecurity. So that has certainly that data sphere of vertical farms of indoor food production need to have secure protection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might add just an example to the sensitivity of that kind of system. You know, here in Arizona, the desert Southwest, the lower Colorado River Valley, particularly the Yuma area of Arizona, a small area, is actually the epicenter for winter leafy green vegetable production. So any of us here in the United States from November, October until about through March could travel to about any place in the country. We could go to the snowy fields of Rochester, Minnesota, Kim, or Minnesota, and sit down and have a nice fresh green salad. Most of that produce is coming out of the lower Colorado River Valley. It's transported and marketed rapidly across the country, mostly by trucks. And the communications, the marketing, the deals that are made with regard to that transportation of that produce also into grocery stores around the country is all done through electronics. And this past year, I know that during the pandemic, there's a lot of discussion about cybersecurity and, you know, the contemplations of what if, you know, we were attacked with a cybersecurity threat, and this was just shut down. This would shut down our food systems, transportation food systems in a system like ours today. So I mean, I can't intimately or in detail describe what's being done about it, but I know the industry is sharply aware of it, and it's being addressed. I just hope it's beyond my wheelhouse to really discuss it in detail, but I know it's being addressed, and I just hope it's being addressed satisfactorily, because it's a real concern. You know, we could be really good at the production level in a system like ours, but that's all it takes to knock it down.
Yeah, and speaking of global trade as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. That's right. Good point. Good question.
This has been an amazing, I agree with Joaquin. It's amazing to see what you four have been able to accomplish in your lifetime. And it is a culture change. And the food system, as I said in the very beginning, must transform to be more sustainable and more equitable.
Yeah.
And you're doing it. So I'm super excited that you show that it is possible to do, and it's working at the local level. And it's working from bottom up. Yes, policymakers need to understand that, but they also need to understand that it's just hard work.
Yeah, exactly. I want to say
thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
I'm getting all kinds of messages from the people behind the scenes saying we're done. So thank you very much for a fantastic couple of hours. You've made my weekend and more.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all. Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you. Nice job. Thank you. Adios.